Hello, this is Mark Sabatella from Outside Shore Music. And in this video, I want to talk about a little transition, just a couple of chords that happen coming out of the introduction into the verse of Brian Wilson's God Only Knows. This is kind of one of his masterpieces. And as I'm recording this video in June of 2025, he had just passed away. And I was talking about this song, talking about a number of different aspects of it during my live stream last week, the Music Masterclass, and I did make reference to this transition. I said, wow, there's something really interesting going on. There's like this modulation or something happening here. Not sure what it is, and I kind of partially played it, but I was like, yeah, I'm not sure what's going on, but there's something non-diatonic happening here. And so afterwards, I went ahead and looked at it a little more detail, listened a little more closely, and realized, yeah, it really is interesting and worth talking about a little bit more. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to play through this introduction going into the first verse. All right, I'm going to play through that, and then, I'll play what I play will be based on the sheet music here, but I'll probably embellish it a little bit based on the chord symbols that I see. But then we're going to just talk about that transition between the introduction and the verse. So it goes something like this. That's as far as we need to go. All right, so first of all, let's talk about what key this piece is in. You know, I've seen this, there's whole video and interviews and so forth talking about this and how the key is ambiguous. And this is true-ish. It's really in E at this point. Even though there's some chords that aren't in the key of E, it doesn't make me say the piece is not in the key of E. All right, this is in the key of E, but it's interestingly in the key of E. All right, so first of all, the first chord is not the E chord. And so when you hear it for the first, 2 seconds of the song, however long that measure lasts, you might be thinking, hey, this piece is in the key of A. You might think it's in the key of A until you hear that. Maybe you at first hear that as 1 to 5, maybe. But by the time the song's gone on a little bit further, it's pretty well established that that is 4 going to 1 in second inversion. And then it comes back to the 4 chord, and then back to 1, and then back to 4 to 1 to 2, and then we kind of expect it to go to 1 at that point. But he doesn't. He goes to a 4 chord here, and this is where it sort of gets interesting. Really more interesting. This is a major triad in second inversion. And then these are all major triads in second inversion. And then going into the verse, we have another major triad, right, in second inversion. Well, this is not diatonic. Major chords don't work that way, right? The only place you normally get 2 major chords a step away from each other is between the 4 chord and the 5 chord. And he gives us that. He gives us the 4 chord to the 5 chord. But that's normally the only place that we would get 2 major chords in a row. What I had said in the master class, and I'll hold to this, is I really expected something more like the following. Let me play from that 5th measure. I expected something like, I expected that to be the bass line. 1, 1, 2, 3, 4, landing on a 4 chord. But that's not what he gives us. He gives us and so that G natural kind of stood out as like, what is that G natural doing there? I expected it to be just a diatonic thing. But it's not just that one note that's out. The whole chord is not. This C chord is not in the key of E. Neither is this D major chord, not in the key. So he ends up using this very typical kind of line, but alters it and alters it in a way where he doesn't just change one note along the way up. He doesn't just change that G sharp to G natural, but when he arrives on that A, it's not the 4 chord. It's not. He doesn't land on a 4 chord. He lands on this non-diatonic D chord. This is what makes us say, or possibly, that there's a new key involved, perhaps. Maybe he's no longer in the key of E. I don't know if that's really a legitimate way of looking at it, but I will say that use of this non-diatonic chord here, and then this is also not diatonic, right? It has a D natural in it. That's not in the key of E. But then he's, whoops, now he's back to the key of E, right? So I wouldn't say he actually modulated. He's just got two really interesting non-diatonic chords in here. To some extent, the way that much works, those couple measures, reminds me of kind of, romantic era composers like Chopin or Schumann, the way they might manipulate harmony, introducing these chords that aren't in the key and don't have a really standard relationship like secondary dominance or something, but have a little bit of a darker, a little bit of a more indirect relationship to the key. And then eventually establish that. No, we haven't modulated, they're just interesting chords. So, I mentioned all this. This is a lot of theory to talk about, and the question always comes up, well, was Brian Wilson conscious of all that, or was he just doing what he felt like? Well, it can be both, right? It doesn't have to be one or the other. You can write something because you hear it, and also be aware that as you're doing it, gee, this is kind of unusual. And all evidence that we have, including quotes from Brian Wilson himself, are that was exactly the case here. He knew perfectly well what he was doing here was a little unusual, but it's not like he worked it out all on paper theoretically first. It's still a very ear process because it's all voice leading. I mean, this is just a stepwise bass line. The fact that it is outside the key a little bit, that's unusual. The fact that we have all these major triads in a row that don't normally happen in a row, that's interesting, but it's also perfectly good voice leading. All the voices moving by step. It's not parallel fifths or anything like that. Also, not that would matter in this context. So, I don't know, that little passage right there that establishes a verse that starts on a chord that's not in the key, and it's the second inversion triad, it really gives you a sense of being a little off balance. The piece never really settles. That is sort of one of the interesting takeaways that you'll get as you study the piece more, if you do, is that despite being in the key of E for, it does modulate later, but despite being in the key of E throughout this section, it never just lands on a plain E triad other than that one little spot we had in the introduction. It's definitely a bit more ambiguous than that. And that sort of ambiguous tonality is one of the things that is so fascinating about this piece in particular. It's not like Brian Wilson does this all the time, but the fact that he has that level of harmonic sophistication going on, as well as all the contrapuntal things that also happen in the piece, that is what makes, I think, this piece one that so many people will turn to if they want to say, well, what made Brian Wilson great? Well, what made him great is he wrote God Only Knows, and that in itself, I think, is all one should need to say.